Well, my sister Lynn was born with hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is water on the brain. So when she was born, she had a small sac on the back of her neck, which was full of fluid, so it kept growing. Then they took her to have surgery in a children's hospital in London and cut the sac off, but the water then went into the brain, so her head grew much bigger than her body. So nobody ever came into the house because the child was very deformed. The head was bigger. It was full of liquid, basically, with a face underneath. So she died at the age of just turning 4, I think, almost 4 years old. And when she died, I had a very profound experience of traveling from a state of sleep into the heavenly realms with her, and we were flying together through a beautiful kind of otherworldly blue hemisphere of beauty. And she was perfect. She wasn't a deformed child. She was like an angel. And that changed my life, really, I think, the dream or that experience, because my vision of what I saw and felt at that time stays with me. So I think that changed my life completely, and has been the thread that runs through my life, that we do not die for the life of us, really. But yes, that was it. It would to, today it would be called a lucid dream, but at the same time an afterlife awareness of not a near-death experience as such, but a journey into the afterlife. There was a very famous surgeon called Ibn Alexander recently had a very profound near-death experience when his brain was comatose completely. And he described also flying on a butterfly wing with this beautiful figure who was a female, who he later discovered was his sister, his half-sister, who he didn't know existed, Ibn Alexander. When he saw a photo of her, he realized that he'd actually been with her in this deep near-death experience. So over the last years, since my own daughter died from drowning, I've been deeply involved in researching, understanding the afterlife outside of all Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, dogmatic traditions, looking at the evidence that's really already there and is quite incredible. So my school life was kind of okay, I guess. I had petit mal. Petit mal is a form of epilepsy, so it's kind of a bit like a visionary experience that happens at different times. I drew a lot. My father was a very good draftsman, and he would draw aeroplanes and ships and things from the Second World War, basically. So I learned a lot from my father, and then I had a little book on tanks, military tanks, called Tanks and How to Draw Them. So there were various kind of tanks, Sherman tanks and German tanks and American tanks, all with different numbers of cogs and wheels and turrets, and very technical. So I was very interested in technical drawing. I was born colorblind, so red-green, so I couldn't go to art college. And then I was, at the age of about 16, was kind of mentored by a very brilliant artist who was only a couple of years older than me, named John Miles. This was in Cardiff in Wales, whose father was also an artist, a landscape watercolour painter. But John was a true visionary. He was, and he introduced me to the art world because I couldn't really go to art college. And and nurtured me in many ways in my understanding of how to draw. He took me under his wing, and I owe him a great debt. He's no longer alive. He died. Drawing certainly came first, yeah. Buddhism was basically from the psychedelic 60 days when people were taking psychedelic drugs, LSD especially. So LSD was around at that time. And of course, everybody who was adventurous had to take LSD, so I did. And at that time, probably about 17. Yeah. So from that, from the visionary experiences one has from taking psychedelic drugs, uh, psychedelic art is very kind of colours. The colours are larger than life, the patterns you see, the imagery. So from that time then I was really drawn to Eastern art. So from like the age of 16 or so. It introduced me to art, yes. Who I would say not just introduced me, but almost put my head in the water. It was like, this is what it's really about. He's a brilliant, brilliant visionary artist. His work is this mandala paintings that he made are fantastically coloured. On my website, you can see, you know my website, tibetanart.com. There's a section on John's work, and you can see some of his work there in larger than life detail if you blow it up. And it's so intricate. And he was a colorist, essentially. He was obsessed by color, and he would go into an orgasm if he passed a kind of fruit stall with all of these oranges and bananas and everything. He kind of really, it was almost like he was fed on color. So he was really an incredible painter, an incredible knowledge of art, and he introduced me to books and different ways of looking at art. Because I couldn't go to art college, so he was a great influence on my life. Many times. I was homeless pretty much most of my life. Yeah. Well, my father and mother separated after my young sister died because there was no longer that need to stay together, I guess. My father found another woman and ended up marrying her, who already had several children. So then he had a very large family of 6 children, 4 of whom were adopted. To Istanbul when I was 17, which took a long time to get there. And there was fascinated by the culture in Turkey, especially with the Blue Mosque. The Blue Mosque was open at night, and one could go there, and there'd be very, very few people there. And it really felt like it was because by that time I'd was very much into symbolism, especially to do with, you could go into a church and understand symbolism in a different way because of psychedelics. Really, it opened the door to the perception. Like, there's a very famous book by Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, which that was my experience in LSD. It wasn't like going to raves and music. It was essentially exploring oneself, yes, exploring the nature of consciousness itself. And the friends I was with at that time were also kind of deep explorers into the spiritual realms, really. Not that long, because I had a kind of psychosis from taking LSD, which is essentially why I left England. I was painting, but I was damaged, and certain of my friends were damaged, basically, from taking psychedelic drugs that were too strong, way too strong. And so it was very difficult to kind of keep oneself grounded, because almost like anything I touched would become part of me, and that was very difficult. So there was a lot of kind of need to move. And then at certain times, I'd feel that I had to go out and just walk because there was no way, even if it was 4 o'clock in the morning, there was no way I could just handle what was happening in terms of being part of the environment around me. It was almost like anything I touched became part of it. So, no, no, John died later. No, 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 he died suddenly and I was shocked by his death. No, no, it was that was a vision from that time, yeah. Went back to the UK, stayed with John and his family at that time then, um, and then carried on painting and eventually decided that the best thing to do because of my mental state was to go to India and Nepal, and that's where my understanding was. Everything I was reading was on esoteric Hinduism and Buddhism, essentially. And there was very little literature at that time, so I left and hitchhiked to India with my girlfriend, who was also a painter. She's now dead, though we were separated long ago. And then went to India first of all in 1970, and then travelled across India during the monsoon and came to Kathmandu, straight to Kathmandu, and that was stayed in Swayambhu to begin with, in a little hut in the fields, the paddy field. I wasn't involved in the hippie movement at all at that time, and then I became fascinated with the culture of Nepal. So that was in 1970. And Swayambhu, because it lived very close, would go up, walk up every day to the top of the hill, and they had a firing range at the bottom, and the bullets sometimes would bounce and come out. So Swayambhu was kind of, Swayambhu itself, a bit of a butterfly. It's big, very big. Swayambhu itself was a kind of magnet, I think. And I returned to Swayambhu after spending a couple more years in India. I came back and stayed here until there was an investiture and all of the streets were being cleaned up. The dogs were being killed and thrown, the stray dogs, because Prince Charles and various dignitaries were coming to Nepal. And most of the Westerners had to leave at that point. So I left Nepal then. Was studying also Sarod, Sangeet. So I'd spend in the early years studying in India also, yeah. Studied in Varanasi in the winters, and then in the summer, early summer 1971, 72, 73 even, in Kangu Valley area. Tashijong was the settlement. First of all in Dharamsala, when the Westerners were starting to come. Siddhi Muni, I only came across his work when I was here in 1973. With a friend, Hugh Downs, who came over with the Peace Corps, an American, and he spoke Nepali and was working with the Sherpas. He produced a book called Rhythms of a Himalayan Village. Hugh Downs was very intelligent. His father was also named Hugh Downs, was a TV presenter, somebody who was very knowledgeable about the world situation. So Hugh was a very clever man. And he was working with an artist in Solakumbu, whose name was Gomchino Leshe, who was a yogi artist, who was drawing these iconographical grids of how the deities are structured. You'll see some of the drawings, they're iconographical grids. You see in the exhibition there's some of these at the moment. So I was learning these systems of measurements. I was aware of them before, but it was through Oleshi that I really began to understand how how the systems of measurements work. My initial learning of that happened while I was in Dharamsala, where I lived in the next room to what was an artist called Lhasa Jampa, from Lhasa Jampa, who was then considered the state artist of Tibet and worked for the Dalai Lama's government, essentially making thangkas for various. No, Dalai Lama was in Dharamsala in India at that time. He'd just come out several years before. Yeah, and then he settled there. So that was very embryonic. Dharamsala was becoming a place of Tibetan culture. Anybody who had knowledge of iconographic, um, yes, and then later on, 1974, 75, I went back to India and lived in a community called Tashijong, which was administered by a lama called Kamta Rinpoche, a great lama, who was also an artist. And he was an amazing man, amazing teacher. This was in the Kagyu tradition, Tibetan Kagyu tradition. So very different from Dharamsala. And he had various yogins there called Togdens. There were 13 Togdens. And they had matted hair. They never cut their hair. And they were real practitioners. And they'd come from Tibet. And they also, in Tibet, there were Togdenmus, which were the female versions of these Togdens. And they did very, very deep esoteric practices, yogic practices. That was with the LSD experience I was talking about. It was that kind of experience of something coming up into the brain and myself going unconscious, of something rising up from the spine right into the head. And I knew that I was going to die. It was death. That's what I experienced. So I fell to the ground and I was unconscious, but not for long, for maybe 30 minutes. And then I came round. Some friends had taken me outside, and then I told them to go and get some medication from hospital, which they did. But that was the kind of Kundalini experience. It was that feeling of something rising up through the central channel, and my head exploded in almost horrific explosion pain. It's like the head suddenly burst open and was vast, with almost like lightning bolts. I definitely, I was finished forever. Any drugs really finished forever. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't even drink very much. A glass of wine. I never get drunk. I never, get intoxicated. Really. Yeah, lots of sadhus and female sadhinis who are also, I don't know, just the presence of these beings in India, I guess. I remember once having a newspaper. I used to read the Times of India, or it would come. I'd do the crossword, the cryptic crossword, and I couldn't understand how any Indian could possibly do the Times of India crossword, because it was from England, basically. A little article about two sadhus who travelled together for 30 years in India somewhere, and one of them died, and it was only when the other sadhu died that his partner realized that he'd been living with a woman. So he thought they were both men. So to me, that kind of sums up the essence of, of real spirituality, where one is neither male nor female. The fact that they were together and they didn't think in those ways, I found it was just a little article, and I thought it stuck so strongly with me that that kind of level of innocence could actually take place in our time. Really. That was the most profound thing of that nature. But I will tell the story of my girlfriend and I. We lived in Tashijong together with Kamta Rinpoche, who had the Togdens, these yogis. And he was a great artist. So I worked with him making drawings like these for various initiations. And he was very, very uh, recognized, renowned as a great master. Um, and he was building a settlement there, which was an art settlement. So there were Tonka painters there, wood carvers, people in manufacturing, cloth, paper making, all kinds of artistic skills. And he was a brilliant Tonka painter himself. And when the temple was being built, funding had been brought in to enable the temple to be built, and he'd commissioned a whole group of statues to be made not Sikkim, in Bhutan by a Bhutanese master statue maker. And the central statue was a figure of the goddess Vajrayogini, which was life size. And there were many smaller statues, and uh, my sister, my girlfriend Linda, asked if she could gild one of the statues. So Kampa Rinpoche said, you have to gild this statue, which is the main statue for the whole temple. And she was very incompetent. She had no idea how to gild properly. So she kept trying and trying, and all the gold leaf was falling on the ground and wasn't doing a very good job. And all of the other artists had finished the gilding, and this main statue hadn't been gilded at all, hardly. And it was the night before the inauguration. The inauguration was happening, and she was still working, and the lights were. It was getting very dark, and suddenly there was a power cut, and so she couldn't do anything. And then Kamta Rinpoche came in, and he saw what had happened, and he went back, came with a torch and some batteries, and just stood there all night with the torch while she gilded the statue. And she was terrified, but because he was there, she finished gilding the statue. And then the next day, when the Togdens came to take the statues, two of them lifted it up and put it on their shoulders, and it floated above. And it was floating in the air, and they couldn't, they had to hold it down. And it still is floating in Tashijong. They put it in the main shrine room, and it was about this high off the ground. And people, when people came, it was the yogins' practice room. They would throw a scarf over and bring it up under like that. And bit by bit it has gone down, but it's still floating above the ground now. That's miraculous activity, which you read about and hear about. And haven't seen it. I haven't been back to Tashijong, but I know that it really happened. And Linda, my ex-girlfriend, told me the whole story, and as did a lady called Annie Tenzing Palmo, who now is at Tashijong. She's an English woman who now trains hundreds of girls from tribal areas of India in the Himachal area as nuns, essentially. So it's a very, very authentic, 100% authentic tradition. So things like that was very strong experience. I believe it 100%, and everybody who's seen that knows that. So in our time, these things can happen, and I take gratitude in the fact that the world is not what it appears to be at all times. There is that beauty of those two sadhus living together for all of those years. Usually completely calm. You have to be calm to draw. I can no longer draw. I have a hand tremor, as you can see. It's just that little tremor like this finger. So when I have to sign things now, it's I have to hold the pencil like this, so I can no longer draw. This has been for about 10 years, I guess. I can retouch paintings a little bit if I need to, but because the brush is different from a pen or pencil. But I can no longer work as an artist. I don't never really painted so much from my head unless it was book covers, like the Gora book cover, which you mentioned, which have a description. Um, but then I haven't drawn or painted for the last many years since Jill and I have been together, which is 25 years. Really, it's a long time. Aeroplane going up. I don't really talk with them now. Maybe I listen to them. Talk with the paintings. Well, this work is iconographic. Most of my work has been drawing. I have hundreds and hundreds of drawings. Nobody's seen, really. These have been printed as screen prints, but I've done maybe 500 drawings, 1,000 drawings, I don't know, of deities, of lineage holders, teachers, of ritual implements, of kind of themes that are involved with both Tibetan and Indo-Tibetan, Nepal Buddhism essentially, and Hinduism, as in Agora, because I feel the affinity between those two traditions. I'm very immersed in Hindu symbolism and culture as I am in Tibetan. They've become very much polarized now. Yes, yeah, I would say. Well, in Nepal, it's Hindu Buddhist, isn't it? It's that's why I love Nepal. I think is because the people are more than anything are the most wonderful people, as far as I'm concerned, on the planet. They're very kind, very generous, very down to the ground, very down to the earth, and I love Nepali people. But Tibetans in the West, Tibetan Buddhism has become, I think, a bit insane. There's so many Westerners now who wear robes and grow matted hair and start their own kind of little groups of Dharma practitioners and then develop some novel aspect which is crosses with other, psychological techniques that are involved in kind of modern therapy, basically. I think it's a bit overplayed. Most of it, I don't do much on the internet at all, but I get endless things about various teachers in America, and they're all Westerners, really. And I think, gosh, I wonder how long you've been involved in this, that you can actually have this ability. I think it's very cultish. It's becoming cultish, really. I've produced, I would say that these drawings on these, if I saw them on the paper, they have a peace, a tranquility, a beauty that I can never possess. So I think what comes through is beauty. Yeah, yeah, and that's certainly true with Newar art, which is why I love the artists so much, because they're such brilliant artists in the Newar tradition. Also, Tibetan art is fantastic, but Tibetan art is much more stereotyped, prescribed, whereas the deities in the Newar tradition are much more devotional, whereas Tibetan art is purely meditation, really. So I differentiate those two traditions, and I defend both sides. I'm not, a lot of uh, people initially would say when they saw Newar paintings, "Oh, this is wrong. This is wrong. And the deity's not like that. It's just the right, wrong posture, wrong color. What's this happening here?" And all of these things going in, but they're actually it's devotional. It moves people. They become icons for the artists, for the people who possess these paintings, and they always have really. And I think the evolution of art now. I was really castigated for what I was doing um, by a lot of so-called uh, academic Buddhist people, but it's become mainstream now. so, I'm kind of glad this has happened in many ways. I no longer feel like I have to defend anything, really. But I'm afraid, you know, still very little is known about both Tibetan and Newar art, about the techniques of drawing, the iconography, the systems of measurement. It's so precise in the Tibetan tradition. The first painting I bought was of a Tamang painter, um, Laman Lama, really. Laman Lama was a Tamang painter. And then I have a four-arm Shenrazi that I bought from Lucky Tonka in Tamil, which I came to Nepal with a friend Lizzie in um, probably around the turn of. I came back from on a trip to Mount Kailash with Namkhai Nobu, which was in the late 1980s. I came to Kathmandu. I had lived in the West since, and we had two children. A previous wife married, and we had two children. And I came to Nepal to go on a trip to Mount Kailash, and it was while within Nepal that I saw how some of my book cover illustrations and had influenced Nepali art. You could see that there was suddenly kind of like sunrise or sunset, yellows in the sky, and a lot of the symbols I'd drawn were being reproduced here, or plagiarized, copied. It was around that time, yeah, more likely in the 90s, 1990s. And then I came with another friend, and we went to James James's Indigo Gallery, and there was a small painting by Uday Charan Shrestha of Avalokitesvara. So I saw Uday's work, and then a friend of mine who was a Tonga painter from Sikkim, in Lepcha, named Punjab. I met him in Nepal. He had a Tonka shop on the corner of Dubba near Tamil side, uh, which was called Punzog's Art. We correct any Tonka. So he was a Tonka painter. So he had knowledge of Tibetan art. So he could correct mistakes in paintings. So he had a great knowledge. And Punzog and I became very, very close friends. And until his death, which is about 15 years later, he would work with the artists on my behalf and go visit them. And I started collecting paintings from Nepal slowly, bit by bit. First quite a bit Tamil art. And then this American guru started to take an interest in Newar art and Tibetan art, mainly Newar art. And he had many, many students, and they would buy paintings that I'd bought here in Kathmandu. So I'd come maybe 3 or 4 times a year and buy a lot of paintings, purple paintings, and sell some, and they enabled me to start building the collection. I was very inspired by Siddhi Muni, who I met way, way back. Yeah. So Siddhi Muni was a great inspiration to me. I have a large collection of paintings. Yeah. Yeah. Not as large as Rajan Shakya as other paintings or other galleries in Kathmandu, which I won't mention. But yeah, it's become a home. My heart is with the artists, not with the collectors and the galleries. And when I've sold to collectors who usually pressure me to kind of sell something, I tend to regret it. I think it really belongs to the artist. It's not about money, it's about love, really. Sold my own painting? I haven't sold many of my paintings, really. Tibet. I had an exhibition in New York. In just, I've never been to America, and this was literally about 10 days after 9/11 that I went to New York for the first time for an exhibition. I'd been working on a collection of Mahasuda paintings for a book on the 84 Mahasudas, which I'd made about 20 paintings or 25 paintings so far and about 50 drawings. I was trying to create the whole 80 series of 84 Mahasudas in the Indian Buddhist Mahasudas. So that was held in Tibet House, and sorry, everything sold. People wanted to buy my art, and suddenly I had $70,000, I think, or something, which I never had any money before in my life. So then at that time, this was before I really started collecting. I went back to Kathmandu and bought these two great works from Siddhi just a year or two before he died. I met Samundra a bit later. Um, I saw Samundra's work, and Uday was my first real introduction. And Uday, I have great respect for as somebody who really is brilliant as a brilliant painter and also has a brilliant mind and does research. He's very erudite and correct in his understanding. Um, I think he's a great teacher. Premman Chitrikar was also a great teacher, but I knew little of him and various others. But I got to know most of the artists, and they were artists now. A lot of work by Devendra, who's a very, very skilled painter, and his brother Mahendra. Um, so yes, basically, I think Uday is a genius, and Samundra is a genius, and all of the others are genius in various forms or whatever. Raj Prakash is a very dear friend. Amrit Dangal, yeah. Ram Prakash, who's done the book of motifs based on my own idiocy to create an encyclopedia of Tibetan symbols. He's created this book on Newa ornamentation and symbols. I studied the systems of measurements very deeply, actually. First of all, when I was with Jampalal, the Dalai Lama's artist, I learned the rudiments, and then in Tashijong, there were Tonga painters there. But mainly, my knowledge came from an artist in Solukhumbu called Gomchen Oleshe. I told this story a couple of times recently. Oleshe was a yogin who lived basically in a tent in the forest, and he was a Tonga painter. Um, he'd taken a vow of living in retreat, so he just had a tent and would paint for the monasteries in the Solukhumbu area within that tent. And a friend who was living in Kathmandu came over, I think, with a Peace Corps. His name was Hugh Downs. He spent several years going back and forth to the Solukhumbu area and wrote a book on the Sherpa communities there called Rhythms of the Himalayan Village, which is mainly about his contact with Oleshe and funeral rituals and the traditions of the Sherpas and the conditions that they lived in. And he'd regularly go up and down. And eventually he paid to have a little wooden house built for Oleshe with a panel he could, all forms of Tara, Padmasambhava, like all of these images based on those iconographical grids, which is from a text by a lama called Nipan, a very great lama. And Oleshe would make these drawings, and then Hugh brought them down to Kathmandu when he was flying back and forth, brought them to Kathmandu, and I copied them. And then when Oleshe died, Hugh inherited all of these drawings and posted them back to America, but they never arrived. So the only person who had this tradition at that time was myself from Oleshe, who I never met. So I owe great debt to Oleshe for being the artist who inspired me to really understand iconography. Well, if that's all they do to make a living, I'm afraid it's a necessity. It's sad, but it's a necessity. Unless they make prints. I'm, I, I made prints. I've sold postcards. Postcards used to be popular. Now I don't sell any. But I produced, I don't know, 500,000 postcards. So sent out and things. It's peanuts in money, you know. But it did work for a long time. Now everybody has mobile phones, so nobody sends postcards or buys them anymore, really. um, so there's a bunch here, a few here of these postcards, like this one of the Medicine Buddha, this one of Kalachakra logo, of the syllables of the Kalachakra mantra, this one of a painting I made after being in Mount Kailash of a dragon and tiger at Lake Manasrovar with Kailash in the background. Dragon and tiger, Chinese symbols of heaven and earth. And this is the face of Haruka Chakrasamvara, drawn on precise iconographical measurements. This is Milarepa. Well, it's my drawing, a painting of Padmapani, which was inspired by Siddhi and I painted this in 1976. So this was a very early work in the Newa style. Large posters were made of this and then brought to Nepal, sold to Nepal. I didn't get any money for it, unfortunately. So the work was copied, and when I mentioned before the yellow in the sky, this caused some kind of influence on the art in Kathmandu because the posters were available everywhere, just as auspicious symbols and Mahasiddhas offering drawings, lotus, etc. Anyway, so it was art like this that I made many, many different images and struggled to make a living. And Jill, my wife now, owns the property we live in. I never owned property. I'm an idiot, really, living the life of such stupidity. But maybe it's, in the end, it's a good thing. It means so many things to so many different people, you know. At the moment, Putin, what does it mean to be alive with your Putin? I wouldn't, you know, everybody is so different, but we do evolve. Slowly, 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 we evolve from life to life. I do believe that's, or I'm convinced that we do not really die as such. I now spend much of my time researching what would be called spiritualism and afterlife research. When my daughter died, Karina, which was 15 years ago, after that, my connection with Buddhism kind of began to fray because I'd been involved also with the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bado Thodol. A new translation was made, and that came literally around the time that my daughter died. And I'd been involved with the illustrations in the book and go into with various things. So I did the Bardo reading myself after she died for those a month of days really, and felt that bit by bit, none of these kind of descriptions of the afterlife matched anything that I'd ever experienced myself. So it was almost like I had to move away from the Tibetan tradition. I had to change. It was a deep need to find truth with a capital T of what living and dying is really about. And since then, that's what I've really researched. I only read books on life after death, or people who have near-death experiences, or people who've done deep research into spiritual movement, which took place over 2 centuries really, but now is not so vividly expressed as it was. But what happened in those 2 centuries is absolutely incredible. And I think we're on the edge of certainly with this new space telescope, we're on the edge of realizing that we live in a multiverse. You know, it's apparent, it's crystal clear, and it apparently has no beginning and no end. So this idea of a Big Bang is even now being debated. So I think we change. Evolution takes place bit by bit, but at the same time, ignorance is just as rich as ever, really. So I'm very interested in science and metaphysics, really, and art, yeah, and anything meaningful. But I've realized the most important thing is to transform oneself. And that's a difficult thing to do, to make oneself a truly compassionate and wise being. But psychedelics do transform people, yeah. And yeah, they certainly cause a change. There's a famous book by Aldous Huxley on heaven and hell. And, you know, Huxley took psychedelics, and I'm not advocating psychedelics by saying this, but he saw immediately the truth of what consciousness is, essentially. He was bright enough to do that rather than just think, oh, this is fun, you know. He saw the nature that things could be just too much. There was too muchness in everything. All of this nature of reality, I think, I'm privileged to explore at this time while I still have a reasonably good memory. Not good enough for most public events, but yeah. Well, having made postcards myself without the consent of artists, I can go to jail, I guess, you know. If you pass on the Monopoly board, you now go to jail, kind of thing. I don't do it to make money. I do it to kind of because the image is beautiful, and I think they should be in print. They should be available. Uh, Everything I do is plagiarized on a daily basis. Thousands of websites I see. At the When I came to Nepal this time, at Rajan's gallery at the top, there was a tattoo convention, and the artists there all have my encyclopedia of Tibetan symbols and motifs, and it was such a wonderful um, what's the word? A feeling of gratitude to be with these people. They were grateful for what I'd done, and I was grateful for the fact that they had the ability to be grateful. They looked to many people they would be quite frightening because one of them had died. The actual tattooed his eye, his eye socket. You could roll the eyes around, and it was black with an iris in the middle, which was normal. Very brave because it could cause blindness eventually. He's only had it for several years. Um, and they're just such beautiful people and so open-hearted and open-minded. And those people, a lot of so-called respectable people think they were decadent and, kind of mad to what they did. But they were so pure to me. They're such beautiful people. I was deeply, deeply touched to be with those people. Yeah, I would say that one of the nicest events in my life was meeting a group of serious. It's much better if if copyright was in place. I've basically just been ripped off endlessly. I never get paid. My encyclopedia, which I spent years and years drawing, really years and years drawing, the publisher who first published that book doesn't pay me any royalties. Now it's with Shambhala Publications. So they're very good. I get paid for them, but it's widely plagiarized on virtually every website of Tibetan artists. Things everywhere, T-shirts and stuff was done. Drawings of mine, yeah. Um, and it's kind of the way it is. You have to accept it. I have to accept it, and it's the way it is. I guess years and years ago when it started, I did get a bit annoyed, think, look, somebody's taken this. But then if the tattoo artists are using these images, that's what they're for, really. Images exist. It's a nice drawing of a particular symbol or motif. And, somebody wants it on the skin, fine. It's great. Yeah. It takes a while for that to come, I think. And the same with cover art. The artists themselves. I just love them because I know them. I'm one. I'm not one of them, but I am one of them as well. From the beginning, I've always respected what they do. I think over the years they have seen some twilight, if not limelight. The twilight comes in the dawn. Their work is now with Rajan opening the gallery and making the work available. It's very different, putting an artist up with artist work, the artist's name, bringing the artist into public. Yesterday, a couple of days ago, I gave a brief talk to the artist, but most of them wouldn't understand what I was saying anyway, because the language is a barrier. Um, but it's been made public, whereas other galleries, because the artist signs the name in Ranjani script, Devanagari script, that people in the West can't read it. And some galleries block out the artist's name, which I think is demeaning to the fact that you know when I started to come across paintings, I already could read a bit of from India, having learned some rudimentary Hindi years and years ago, most of which I've forgotten. But I can kind of bit by bit find out the names of the artists. I have a whole book on Ranjana characters, which is very useful. Um, but I think it's very important that the artists are recognized and known and not kind of kept in the cupboard. And I think this has happened in my time. I've tried to make their names available and and talk about them as friends and people. But really, I feel we're brothers, really. Brothers. And a few sisters, not many, but we're really brothers in art. It's both, I think, both simultaneously. It's great to have an innate artistic gift to be able to draw very accurately. You know, a lot of people can just create portraits without any artistic training. I never went to art college, so you know, I'm not. I would say I'm not a great draftsman, but I'm determined to create a brush and line and ink or gouache painting with precision. You know, I could do that, and they can do it. It takes time. It needs talent. Talent is often innate. People tend to have the ability to do these things. Uh, and if you don't have any talent, it can be it's frustrating and very difficult. So I would recommend that you just become an appreciator rather than an artist in certain cases. Yeah, yeah. What will you do with this material? If you don't mind me asking. Then I've had them photographed professionally so that I can make prints of them now myself. I set up a website, tibetanart.com, which I mentioned at the beginning, um, but to make the work available so that people would begin to know about it. And I believe has happened. It's just to make the work known, really, to make the work of these artists known. Uh, with my collection, my idea was to try and exhibit them in the West, but I'm very hopeless that contacting the people in the positions, academics or people who work with museums or galleries, I'm not very good at that. And other people tend to come along who are good with those things. It's difficult to explain, really. I guess I wanted to kind of create a book of a lot of those paintings with descriptions of the images, but I never really found the right publisher to do that, or a publisher who was that interested. Um, there's new books are coming out at the moment here in Nepal. Well, what Rajan is producing, you know, there's catalogues, very, very good. And also just recently, Ujai has just recently published a book. Ram Prakash has done a fantastic book. Ujai's book is just literally come out. It's actually well printed, and the text is good. It's good research. But what Ram did was phenomenal, I think, in producing that book of line drawings. Really, that deserves to be uh, developed. Because jewelry researchers in all over the world would be fascinated by that in Japan or whatever. Uh, so just to kind of to make a basic living, it's been a struggle for all of these artists. But I think you know, when people they ask me what can I do, what can I do, what can I do, I just said, well, just progress this slowly, 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 slowly. It has to go that way, really, unfortunately, because so much is involved in the financial transactions of the paintings. I do really believe that the art world in the West is gone berserk. Most of it, you know, this idea of modern art. I have no interest in it whatsoever. I just think it's ridiculous in many, many, many cases. Um, and I don't know, just bit by bit. I'm having a small exhibition at the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts this winter with Aung Sering Sherpa, whose exhibition on spirits is great work. He's having success. So some of the artists are having success. He's has work in Vienna Biennial, I think. Um, so there is room for hope, and as long as the planet stays alive, but that's the real problem, isn't it? Is what's happening to planet Earth, really. Uh, Yeah, and just the news is terrible. You look at the news and everybody's dying from droughts and floods, and now cholera from. It's yeah, it's tough. And art is a mistress, really. You serve her, but it doesn't really serve you to be. Thank you for taking the time.